And as one does, me and one of the strangers I had just met went into a tattoo shop and we wanted to get souvenirs, basically. So he asked for the Guinness harp. It looked perfect. I asked for an airplane. It looked like a penis.
You are listening to Personal Development Mastery, the podcast that empowers you with the simple and consistent actions to take that will help you create a life of purpose and fulfillment. I am your host, Agi Keramidas, and this is episode 412. How can you turn ordinary personal stories into authentic and relatable narratives that will impact your professional and personal success? By listening today, you will discover how to turn everyday moments into compelling narratives. You will learn how to embrace vulnerability in your storytelling, and you will hear valuable tips on how to select and craft relatable professional stories that resonate deeply with your clients. Before we dive in, if you enjoy listening and appreciate what we're doing here, the simple, quick favor I'm asking of you is to click the subscribe button. Now let's get started. Today it is my pleasure to speak with Sara Lohse. Sara, you are a storyteller, author, marketer, and brand architect, helping mission-driven brands amplify their impact. You are passionate about using authentic storytelling as a powerful tool for connection and impact, and you are dedicated to helping individuals find and share their personal stories, transforming them into thought leaders. Sara, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm very excited for this conversation, Sara, and we're going to talk, and I think somehow my introduction gave it away a little bit. We're going to talk about how to harness the power of storytelling that we all have, so we can grow our business or become a thought leader also. That's the two things that I saw distinctly that you talk about. So before we go there, would you like to share maybe a pivotal moment when you realized the true power of storytelling yourself?
Yeah, it was a couple years ago. And currently, I do a lot with helping people guest on podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
But before I had ever been a guest on a podcast, I accidentally got myself booked on one of the biggest finance podcasts in the world.
Okay.
To not talk about finance at all, but to tell a really embarrassing story about a bad tattoo I got on a vacation. And that somehow changed my entire career, because this was a story that I would tell at a bar for a laugh. And it was so small, so silly, no value to it,
Mm-hmm.
but it was funny. So the host wanted me on his show to tell that story, and it became his job to find the value in it. So he actually guided me to tell this ridiculous travel tattoo story in a way that made it a really powerful journey of self-discovery and how I changed my life and became more brave and started taking more risks. So that was the day that I learned how to tell my own story and learned that no matter how small and inconsequential a story seems, if you know how to tell it right, it can have a huge impact.
I'll come back to that for sure. Right now, I'm fascinated the way you described it already. I'm fascinated to hear that story about the tattoo, because it's impossible not to ask now. So I'm looking forward to hearing what was that story then that created this shift for you.
So I took a solo trip to Ireland back in my early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on a bar crawl through Dublin with a bunch of strangers because it was solo trips. I didn't know anybody. And as one does, me and one of the strangers I had just met went into a tattoo shop and we wanted to get souvenirs, basically. So he asked for the Guinness harp. It looked perfect. I asked for an airplane. It looked like a penis. So I came home, was mortified, got it covered as soon as I could. But fast forward a couple of years, I'm at Podcast Movement in Nashville. I stalked the host of Stacking Benjamins for 3 days, trying to get him alone so I could talk to him. I wanted to book the host of a show I produced at the time on his show because it's one of the biggest finance shows. And I finally get him alone. I have him cornered. And I pitch the host, say all of these great things about how he's an expert in this, and he has these designations, this many years of experience. And Joe just looks at me and says, yeah, that's great. I don't need an expert. I want someone with a cool story. And I think I had a stroke, maybe, because what I said next was, do you want to hear about the time I got a tattoo of a penis while I was in Ireland? And he did. And that is how I accidentally got myself booked on Stacking Benjamins.
It's a very interesting story, absolutely. And you were saying earlier, and I'll come back to that, about, this particular story with the tattoo. It has certainly an element of humor, an element of mystery, and an element of embarrassment. So there are many things, vulnerability maybe is a better word than. So I will go back a few steps, and I will. You were saying that all stories, or each of us, has stories that are powerful and that they can make an impact. So let's go a little bit back, because someone might not be ready to open up and share something like, what you did in the podcast, which is great for you. But I'm sure you can appreciate that maybe many people would prefer to share
and
something.
And many people have asked why I did.
So I want to speak a little bit more about the more, let's say, ordinary, and I will say it ordinary, quote unquote, because there are no ordinary moments or ordinary stories. But can you tell me about the power of those stories? So let's move over there first.
Yeah. The ordinary stories are really the ones that I want to focus on, because those are the ones that I think are the important ones. Yes. And the reason for that is you can hear these amazing stories that are headline worthy, that change the world, that are just these massively impactful stories. And those are great and they're inspiring and all of that, but they're not relatable. I've never experienced something like people like Malala or Martin Luther King Jr., like all of these people who have these amazing stories that everyone around the world knows. I don't have that. I have ordinary stories. I have everyday struggles. I have stories of me just trying my best and messing things up and having to fix them, and all of these just little stories that make up my life. And that's what you have too. And that's what most of us have. So when you focus on those little stories, even though they seem small, everybody listening probably has been through something similar. And when we tell stories, we tell them because we want to build connections, and connections come from shared experiences. So telling those experiences, you tell the people that you're talking to that I know what you've been through because I've been through things that are the same. And this is how I got through it. And this is what happened with me. And I can help you also make it through whatever the small experience is.
That's great. And, I was thinking that about the ordinary stories, about the story of someone who has done something extraordinary, like, climbed Mount Everest or whatever. That story might sound very impressive, but it's not relatable at all because no one has done it.
Exactly.
What I got that was very important was you talked about the building connection, because the audience or the feels that the experience is shared. So what I wanted to discuss with you and hear your expertise is, each of us, the person listening right now, have many stories like that. Many. What are some ways that one can, find them among the collection that they may have? And let's start with that. What are some ways, in other words, which of my life are the good stories or the relatable stories? Or does it depend on something else?
It depends on so many things, and it depends on the situation. It depends on what you're trying to relate to, what message you're trying to present, and what you're trying to get people to understand. But a lot of the times, all you really need to do is look back at the moments that were kind of like the fork in the road. Like, when did you have to make a big decision? When did you have an experience that changed something for the future? And those moments of just big choices and the moments of change, the moments that you kind of got a new perspective, those are so important because other people have been through similar struggles. They've had to decide one thing or
Yes.
another. Everyone's been through that. So if you can talk about a big moment in your life that changed something for you, that's going to be an important story.
I get the forks, as you said, the decisions, and definitely that is very. I was just thinking that my best stories are about a big shift and big change to something else. Having had those stories, or having decided, shall we say, that okay, I'm going to pick this and that from my life, of this decision or of this major shift or anything else. What is then a way to refine these stories? Because, and I know I'm asking I'm asking you to give me a condensed version of what you know, which I know it's not possible, but I want to at least get an overview of how one can refine these stories and work on them.
Yeah, there's a few factors that I think make a story very compelling. One is that it has the right amount of detail. When I told you my simple little tattoo story, I didn't tell you the entire backstory. I didn't tell you
Yeah.
what happened next, and I didn't tell you all of these extra details. I only told you the details you needed to know so that you would understand the story. And that's important because a lot of people, they'll over detail it and they'll get lost in the weeds. You want to give details. You want people to be able to see it happening so that they can feel like they were there, because that's almost like faking a shared experience. If they feel like they were there, they feel like they've gone through it. So you want to get rid of all those extra details that you don't need. And you want it to be unexpected. And that can be the difficult part, especially when it comes to these ordinary everyday stories, because they're not that unexpected. It's everyone's been through this. So that is kind of the trick to making it the way that you tell it being important. So
Okay.
my story of this tattoo, it could have just been a story of I went on a trip, realized I could do things on my own, decided to pack up, move across the country, all of that. That's kind of expected. Like, okay, big decision, have this big experience, make changes from there. But instead, I tie it back to the embarrassing part. And I got the tattoo as a reminder of that trip. So now it stands as a reminder of all of these things that happened. But if I just come out and say, I got a tattoo of a penis while I was in Ireland, no one sees that coming. So I'm able to take this simple story and make it unexpected by focusing on kind of like the punchline of the story.
If you enjoy this episode, can you think of one person that would find it useful and share it with them? I'd really appreciate it. It helps the show grow, and you will also be adding value to people you care about. Thank you. And now let's get back to the episode. Give me one more example. I like this, the unexpected thing. So, if can you pick another story, like a more, let's say, not as intense, shall we say, as your tattoo story, and give me that or an example of that unexpected element, or how can Yeah, what's one kind of trick or technique that you use to make it unexpected?
So the technique that I use, it's kind of storytelling in reverse,
Mm-hmm.
because I call it the upfront method. It's the I bet you're wondering how I got here kind of storytelling that you see in movies and on TV. Instead of
Mm-hmm.
me telling the story and leading up to, oh, and then I got this tattoo, I tell the punchline first. So I could have told that whole story and then said, and then I got a tattoo. And it doesn't have the same punch. It doesn't have the same effect because you've already kind of been bogged down with all of these details and everything. And you've been trying to figure out, all right, where is she
Mm-hmm.
going with this? But
Okay.
instead, just taking the ending and that hook and moving it to the beginning, it changes the power of it because it removes the context. And if you take away context, anything can become unexpected.
That's true. Remove the context. That's a very good tip, Sarah. Thank you. Uh, let's talk also about some common mistakes that you see people that share stories make. You already said about going into many details which are
Mhm.
unnecessary. So give me one or two more of the common mistakes.
Yeah, one that I see a lot is something I call forced vulnerability. And
Mm.
for some reason, when we talk about stories, we talk about telling stories and personal stories that we use in the professional space and all of that. People seem to think that the story has to be a sob story and it has to be a very emotional, very heart wrenching story. And what I've seen people do is they tell this really big, impactful story from their life that changed their life, that either they had a disease they thought they were going to die, or they were poor and about to live on the street. All of these things that are very great stories. But then they
Mhm.
try to tie it to a message that doesn't fit. And it's like trying to force a lid on this story that just isn't meant for it. And it feels so disjointed. So you hear this story and then they say, and so this is why you need this, or you need to do this, or you need to understand this. And it's like, that's not why. That doesn't add up. But they wanted to use that story to get that connection and to really draw the audience in. But then when you get to the end, you lose them. So I think people need to realize that you don't have to tell that emotional of a story, especially in the professional space. Yes, personal stories are great, but you can also tell professional stories. You can tell case study stories. You could tell stories about a project that you worked on for a client and the results that you got. You can tell stories that are not heart wrenching if they're going to drive the
Mhm.
point home better.
You said, that some people try to tie the story to a message that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't fit. And I wanted to ask specifically, for someone listening who is an entrepreneur that uses, or wants to use storytelling in order to get more clients. Which kind of story, or how can one select the stories that then the message will fit? Has it have to do, how much relevant can it be? Are there any guidelines there with that?
That's a really good question. Um, Part of it is the story should be connected to how you learn the lesson that you're trying to teach. And what I see is people will take the thing that changed their life the most, and because it changed their life, it must have impacted the way they learn the message. But it's really a stretch. It's not easy to see that connection. So when you look specifically at this is what I want you guys to understand, this is how I learned it. Think back to what
Mhm.
was happening when you learned it. What was the circumstances? What was the situation that you were in? What did you have to do differently? What did you learn? And that's going to be way more relevant than trying to
Mhm.
force in something really emotional. And you can still have emotions and stories like that. Stress is an emotion, anxiety, things that are, you are overwhelmed and this is how you felt. It doesn't have to be scared. It doesn't have to be heartbroken. It can just be those feelings that we experience at work every day. Those are still emotions. And I think one of the things that is really going to be pivotal in having those connections is we tend to only show our highlight reel. We want to tell the stories of this is how I reached this level of success and I did this fantastically and now everything in my life is great. That is not true. I promise you, you have messed something up. And if you've never messed something up, you've never tried anything new. Mm-hmm. So transparent recount stories, talk about the mistakes. Every story doesn't have to have a happy ending. And my favorite stories are the ones that don't. The ones that you messed up, you tried to fix it, and you couldn't, and you had to start over. It doesn't have to be, and then I found the solution. Sometimes you don't. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's back to the drawing board. And being able to tell a story like that, admitting that you're not perfect, you mess things up, you don't always know the answer, but you're able to show that no matter what, you still kept trying. And you've gotten to this point because despite not finding those answers all of those times, you kept trying again and again until you found it. And we try to avoid those stories because we want to seem impervious. We want to seem perfect. And that's not relatable. Mm-hmm. Nobody is.
We started the conversation and talking about vulnerability in the storytelling. So tell me a bit more about, its importance or anything else that might be important for someone listening and wondering, shall I not?
Vulnerability is incredibly important because it makes you human. And if I'm listening to someone tell a story and they sound like a corporate stooge that's just telling the history of the company, that's not interesting. That's not compelling. I don't feel like I'm talking to a person. I feel like I'm talking to a humanized logo. And especially because a lot of the times I'm talking to entrepreneurs and I'm talking to small businesses, people who really are their brand. Mm-hmm. You have to see your brand as more than just a logo. You have to see your brand as just an extension of who you are. And it's just you on paper. Like my company, Favorite Daughter Media, you can look at anywhere on either my website, my book, anything you see, you're going to just see me. It's so personal that way because I did that intentionally. Mm-hmm. So when you're able to open up and show that you're human, people don't want to connect with the business. They want to connect with the people behind it. So you're going to instantly grab people in far more than you would if you tried to just stay as a company or stay being that brand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sarah, tell me also about your book, which is the Art of Storytelling for Aspiring Thought Leaders. I'm asking specifically, what shall someone expect to find there, or what will they get by getting the book, reading the book?
Yeah, open this book, The Art of Storytelling for Aspiring Thought Leaders. It was a project that took me over a year to finish, and I wanted to write it because I had a ridiculous way of figuring out that my story mattered, and I wanted other people to figure that out. So it's kind of a part book, part memoir, part journal. It's a little bit of everything because I'm teaching how to tell a story. It talks about the types of stories you can tell, how to figure out which ones are important, how to structure it so that it's really compelling, all of these different concepts that are really vital to telling a good story. But the way that I teach it is I teach it through my own stories. Mm-hmm. Because if I'm telling you, the title itself is kind of a pun. It's Open This Book because I want you to become an open book, tell your stories. And if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to expect that of you, I have to do it myself. So all of the lessons, there are some case studies and examples from pop culture that people will understand, but a lot of it is just my own stories. And I even include the maid of honor speech from my best friend's wedding because it's a great example of a certain way of telling a story and structuring a story. So it's very personal. So it almost borderlines memoir. But after every section, I give journal prompts and thinking exercises and ways that people can start writing down their ideas, getting their stories together, and really putting all of the different concepts into action. Because I can just tell you to think about this, but I want you to really do it. And I really want people to start coming up with those stories that they didn't see value in before and realize that there is some value there.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Sarah. And you also have a free storytelling journal, which I understand that you will give to the listeners. So tell us about that as well.
Yeah, all of the journal exercises that I put in my book, I pulled out as well, and I have them available for a free download at openthisjournal.com. So it's everything from the book. I include a little bit of context, so the journal entries are easier to understand without giving the entire book away. But all of the journal prompts are in there, so you can just print it out and start working on your story just for free.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. That is,
Yeah.
it's a great step. And let me ask you one more. Apart from this, from someone getting your journal and seeing for themselves the power of what it is that you do and how you share the storytelling, what is some other action that one can take, tonight or tomorrow morning to improve, let's say, or carry on that journey into better storytelling, more impactful storytelling? I know we've said quite a few already, but is there anything that comes to mind that might be very relevant now?
Yeah, a couple.
Okay.
One would be just be very cognizant of just your day to day, because every day something is going to happen that can be a great story. There's a quote that I include in my book that's great stories happen to those who can tell them. So pay attention to the details and pay attention to the emotions that you feel when something happens in your day, because those are stories that you can come back to later. And another thing, okay, it's always hard to put these into words, which is my job. I'm a storyteller, but so pay attention to things that happen every day. But also, I'm a writer, and I've always been a writer. And they say that if you want to be a great writer, you have to be a great reader.
Yes.
If you want to be a great storyteller, you have to listen to stories and read stories. And it's almost like practice makes perfect. And sometimes the way that we practice is by watching the greats. Watch people tell stories. And the storytellers that I admire the most, and the people that I think tell the best stories, are stand-up comedians. So this is a very easy and fun piece of homework. Go watch stand-up comedy. They are such masters at telling stories. Not all of them, of course. There's going to be a couple that are like, but some of the greatest storytellers ever were stand-up comedians, because they managed to take a story that is so relatable and make it compelling, make it funny, but it's something that an entire stadium can relate to. And they don't generally talk about these crazy stories and these crazy unrelatable topics. They talk about the most simple things. They talk about airline food and traffic and things that are generally like, okay, that's super boring. No one wants to listen to that. But they tell it in a way that is interesting and is compelling and is funny. And they choose those stories for a reason. They choose it because it's what every single person in that stadium has dealt with. There's probably not a single person there that hasn't been stuck in traffic or hasn't been stuck on an airplane. So they choose those boring stories, but they're so great at telling them that they make them not boring. So watch stand-up comedians, watch the commencement addresses at colleges, watch people give their maid of honor speeches or their best man speeches. Anyone who's telling a story, just watch how they do it and you're going to learn so much and start emulating the people that do it really well.
Thank you very much. This was brilliant. The actions, the listen, read stories, and also be cognizant of your day to day. These are very useful, Sarah. Thank you. Before we wrap up today, and thank you very much for this very valuable conversation.
Thank you
and
for
I hope
having
that
me.
we did give, to someone that was not sure whether the story is powerful enough, that at least the incentive to think about it more and realize that every story is powerful, as we were saying, in the very beginning. I do have two quick questions that I always ask my guests.
Okay.
And the first one is, what does personal development mean to you?
Oh, that's a good question. For me, personal development is just always growing and growing in something that excites you. I think of personal development as becoming an expert in a topic, but expertise is something that is misunderstood. I don't think to be an expert, you have to know everything. To be an expert, you just have to be endlessly curious about something and always be learning more about it, always be looking for more answers and finding new questions. So if you want to develop, just be curious.
I like that. Thank you. And a hypothetical question. If you could go back in time and meet your, let's say, 17-year-old self, what's one piece of advice you would give her?
Stop posting dramatic song lyrics on Facebook. Throw out those pants you really liked. They look terrible. Don't get bangs. But also have more respect for yourself. I think it took me many, many years to accept who I am and be willing to be unapologetically myself. And I wish I'd done that sooner.
Very solid piece of advice. Sarah, I want to thank you very much for our conversation today. I enjoyed it very much, and there were many things that I also learned with what you were sharing and got inspired to do. So I want to wish you all the best with your both in your personal and professional life. I will leave it to you for parting words or some actionable wisdom. I will leave it to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. If anyone wants to start telling their story, wants to start learning how to tell it better, go to openthisjournal.com and download the free journal. And if you come up with your story, send it to me. I would love to read it. If you go to Open This Journal, all of my contact info and everything is there. So reach out to me and tell me your story.
And before I end today's episode, if you enjoy this podcast, can you think of one person that would find it useful and share it with them? I'd really appreciate it. It helps the show grow, and you also add value to people you care about. Thank you. And until next time, stand out, don't fit in,